All right, look on page 279. The two schools of thought are caveat emptor and caveat venditor. Okay, and they both have strengths and weaknesses. So let's put these strengths and weaknesses up on the board and let's talk about the two schools. Literally, these terms just mean buyer beware. Caveat emptor is buyer beware, and caveat venditor is seller beware. Okay, quite literally. And in fact, I'm reading here, consumer sovereignty often shares the view of the classic Latin aphorism, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. This motto has been used in commerce to claim that a buyer should not expect compensation for defects in a purchase that is unfit for its ordinary purpose. There is no warranty, the buyer takes the risk. In accordance with the caveat emptor principle, the seller should only warn of substantial latent defects in the product, but not of anything else that might discourage a purchase decision. Okay, the caveat emptor, let's imagine a pure caveat emptor situation, just so we can take this to an extreme and think about the strengths and weaknesses of such a situation. So let's imagine a situation with very few, if any, regulations, almost no regulatory oversight, a kind of a Wild West. So late 19th century, let's say there's a little town in the old-timey American West. You live in this town, and maybe there's a sheriff, a marshal, and maybe a deputy, but that's about all the law enforcement there is. It's really, really wide open. Few regulations. And you've got some health problems. You're just a town resident, maybe you're a farmer. You've got some health problems, maybe you got eczema on your skin, let's say. Okay, and I ride into town with my wagon, and I sell oils and ointments for all kinds of problems. Okay, and I pitch you a deal, sell you oils to help you with the eczema on your skin. You take the oils, okay? You go back to your residence. You wake up the next morning, your skin on your arm has now turned green. Okay, it didn't work. What recourse do you have? Well, you immediately go to find me. I have skipped town overnight. I have sold you the product, sold a bunch of other people products, and I have now left for the next town. Okay, what recourse do you have in response to me? Well, you could form a posse. You could call the marshal, but he's got other things to do. There's not a lot you can do. You can't litigate because the courts of law are not, operative enough in this area. You'd have to pursue some form of vigilante justice. A clear weakness of such a system, where it's pure buyer beware and there are almost no consumer protections, when the product fails to function as advertised or actually harms the consumer. A clear weakness of such a system is that it leads to a complete absence of consumer assistance or consumer oversight or consumer protection. Okay, and this is something that a lot of people in the 20th century have found untenable. The general trend over the last 50 years or so has been away from caveat emptor and towards caveat venditor, at least in the United States. Okay, it's not the trend always and everywhere in every field, but the general trend has been away from the buyer beware principle toward the seller beware principle. Often that's been driven by high-profile legal cases where a particular product led to the death of a vulnerable party, and a big settlement was reached where the family or friends of the vulnerable party make a lot of money from a court-awarded settlement, and this has caused later companies to become more cautious, and it has moved the ball towards caveat venditor and away from caveat emptor. Okay, but in our old-timey West scenario, an absence of consumer protections is clearly a big problem with the caveat venditor model. Having said that, and accompanying that, I should say, is cautious consumers, the cautious consumer problem. So if consumers don't believe that they have recourse in circumstances where the marketing disclosures have not adequately warned them about potential hazards of the product, they're going to be much less willing to purchase. And when consumers are much less willing to purchase, the streams of commerce don't flow as freely, and it's a lot harder for transactions actually to take place because there's less trust. So the presence of regulations promotes trust, increases trust in the marketing relationship. Now, having said that, there are certain strengths of the caveat emptor system. Again, a system without regulatory oversight, a system that does not require substantial efforts on the part of sellers to quality control or test products prior to selling because of their fear of litigation. What might be some of the strengths of a caveat emptor system? And I'm thinking here from the perspective of a consumer. Clearly, from the perspective of a seller, it's cheaper for the seller to be in a caveat emptor system. From the perspective of a consumer, what might be the strengths of such a system? Diana, do you know? Elijah? Does anybody want to take a guess?
I could think of a seller one.
What's that?
I could think of a seller one.
Okay.
It'd be easier to start a business.
Absolutely, it's easier to start a business in a caveat emptor system. That's one strength of it. And in fact, actually, that's a strength from the perspective of a buyer too, of a consumer, because that means there's more innovation, more creativity. Okay, I was actually thinking of a different one though. I mentioned it's cheaper for sellers. It's cheaper for buyers too. Cheaper products. After all, it's really expensive for companies to devote a whole wing of the company to a stable of lawyers to protect themselves against litigation. It is really expensive for companies to beta, gamma, and delta test their products, often restarting their product lines because of their fear that maybe some problem with the product has gone untested in their alpha tests and needs now to be identified in other rounds of tests. Those are all expensive, and the cost savings of not going through those tests gets passed on to the consumers, and they buy cheaper products in a caveat emptor system. When there are large legal settlements, like there are in a caveat venditor system, that end up rewarding people who have been damaged by malfunctioning products, that increases the cost of those products for everyone in such a system. Because the car malfunctioned when, remember in the Ford Pinto case at the beginning of the semester, because the car malfunctioned and killed a bunch of people, everybody started paying more for cars because of all the tests that companies now do and because of all of the litigation costs that Ford had to go through. Diana?
Why wouldn't you say cheaper quality? And why, I'm not sorry, lower quality?
That is absolutely a weakness of the system. Lower quality.
Well, why is, because to me that's equal to cheaper product.
Great. Let's think about that for just a second. Okay, so when the government doesn't protect you as a consumer by providing you with the possibility of litigation settlements if and when the product malfunctions, like our court system does much of the time these days, what kind of protections do you have in a full-fledged caveat emptor system when the products are of low quality or when products malfunction even? What kinds of protections do you have? What can you do? If you lived in the Old West with few or no regulatory oversights, how would you protect yourself?
You would have to figure out information, like it would be on you to figure out how to use the product.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You'd have to protect yourself. You would have to do your own due diligence. You would have to spend more time informing yourself about the products that you purchase. Because there's no standard of expectations where you know that the government's got your back or the court system has your back and enforces and ensures that these products will function as advertised. Okay, so maybe a strength of the system, kind of flip side of the lower quality of a caveat emptor system, a strength of such a system is it promotes consumer responsibility. Okay, these days when I purchase something, I'd say if it's $20 or less, I hardly think about it at all. If it's $100 or more, I take some time and think about it. You know, I compare my options. I look at the quality reviews of different products. I think about it for a little while because it's a substantial purchase. If you're in a pure caveat emptor system where there's no quality control protection from larger regulatory forces, you probably are going to be a much more responsible consumer in terms of informing yourself about the nature of the product than most people are these days. Okay, just as as a matter of course, you probably will be. And I would put that in the strengths category because that's, I think, a good thing. Okay, I think it's a bad thing that many people go around these days relatively uninformed about the quality of the products that they're purchasing.
You know, customer loyalty, because once you find a brand that
Exactly. Yeah.
you're gonna develop a close relationship with the person you're selling.
Yeah. And the way that quality control is ensured in a caveat emptor system as opposed to a caveat venditor system is not through regulatory oversight. It is through reputation and customer loyalty. And if your business loses its reputation for good products, you're done in this sort of a system. Whereas you can recover in this sort of a system if your business loses its reputation. Because reputation is not as important in a caveat venditor system as it is in a caveat emptor system. Everything depends on reputation in this kind of a system. Now, one of the reasons why we've been moving, I should say actually, as I make this comment, the strengths and weaknesses of a caveat venditor system are precisely the opposite. So to avoid having to write all these down on the board, let me just say that the products are more expensive, there's less consumer responsibility, there's greater consumer protection, consumers are less cautious, so the commerce flows more freely, and products have greater quality. Okay, so it's just the flip side, right? All right, now one of the reasons, though, why we have moved in recent decades toward a caveat venditor system and away from a caveat emptor system in this country is because we have moved more and more toward a mass society. Okay, a society where you are purchasing products from vendors who are coming from the other side of the world, right? And maybe in an old west town where everybody knows everybody, you can base commerce on reputation, and that works for a while. But in a mass society where your headphones might be coming from a company in Korea that you've never heard of before, the presence of regulations and regulatory oversight makes up for the absence of reputation by providing customers with some kind of a guarantee. Maybe it's not a great guarantee, but it's something that there will be legal recourse if the product doesn't function as advertised or if it even harms or damages the customer. Okay, so the move toward a mass society and away from a relational, more closely knit, folksy kind of a society like was the case in the American past is a major reason why we've moved towards caveat venditor and away from caveat emptor. Now, I want to say, having said that, although most trends have been in this direction in recent decades, there are a few industries where the trends have been going in the other way. Okay, there are a few industries where things have gone the other way. One example is the credit card industry. Okay, and in the credit card industry, actually, it used to be like this. Okay, we used to have in the credit card, actually in the United States, we used to have what are called usury laws. Laws against excessive interest. Lenders couldn't charge more than a maximum interest cap that was actually set by the government. And this started to change in the 1980s. This brought about an enormous explosion in the credit card industry. And nowadays, consumers are largely on their own in this particular industry. Okay, credit cards are ubiquitous. Everybody uses them. And companies can now change the terms of their credit cards agreements. All they have to do is just give consumers about a 10-day or 15-day notice. I'm not sure what precisely the number is. And they can change the terms of your credit agreement with them. And moreover, there's no cap on no cap on interest rates, no usury law. Usury laws have been done away with. So you see all over Houston. Okay, I see when I go home. I pass on my way home. I look to the side of the highway. I see a shopping center with several payday loan places. Okay, those places are total shark-infested waters. All right, stay far away from those places. Okay, the interest rates that they charge on an annualized basis can sometimes be up to 1,000 or 2,000%. It's crazy. Okay, because they're unsecured loans, and unsecured loans, they'll basically it's only secured by your paycheck the next time around, and they'll get the equivalent. They're preying upon desperate people who are living paycheck to paycheck and don't have anything in savings, and it's a bad sort of a situation. But those businesses exist because there are no usury laws now. Okay, so the credit card industry is one example of an industry where it has actually moved away from consumer protections toward a buyer beware kind of a model. Okay, but most fields of business have moved the other way in recent decades. All right, let me stop and ask if there are comments or questions about these different models. I have a question for you. Which would you rather live under? Would you rather live under a model that requires consumers to exercise maximal responsibility, that doesn't give them any protections or few resources in case of product malfunction? Would you rather live under a model where things are more expensive, but consumers get protected in circumstances where products don't function as advertised or disclosures aren't adequate? Which would you prefer? Number 3, option number 3. Yes, the book does provide us with option number 3. The book often takes a middle of the road approach, and it says something in the middle between these two. Aristotelian, yeah.
I've
Okay. Okay. Sure.
More deregulation because I don't think it flows very well when it's all regulated.
When it's all regulated, okay. You're not alone. I too am often frustrated by the expensiveness of the products that I purchase, knowing that the price of those products is actually increased by the litigation. For instance, I am shocked almost every time I go to the doctor at how expensive it is. And you know why? It's because of litigation. That's a main driver. Not everything is traceable to litigation, but that's a main driver of the expense. They have to carry enormous amounts of insurance.
The regulation becomes a business, and then it becomes abuse.
Yeah, and then it becomes predatory as well sometimes. But that's an example of the medical field these days. Is an example of a field that has swung so far in this direction because of the lawsuits that have been undertaken against doctors and the insurance that they have to take out in response now to those potential lawsuits. It's swung so far in this direction, it has jacked up the price for normal people like me to such a great degree that I now pay a substantial percentage of my income every year to provide medical care for. I've got several dependents. I got to provide medical care for my fam, and that's substantial. At the same time, like I mentioned in the Wild West scenario, your skin turning green and you having no recourse, there's nothing you can do is also pretty frightening as well. Something in the middle probably is best. I tend to be more of a gambler when it comes to life, and I tend to think that I can protect myself, and I know how to do due diligence. So I tend to favor this a bit more than that, but not everybody agrees with me. If you're more cautious, more cautious type, you'll probably tend in this direction.
You can't do it, at least in a close-knit society where we can make those close-knit communities online,
Mm-hmm.
where we have the product reviews and we can like look it up. Like we have the information
Yes.
to do together.
Yes. So, yes and no, actually. If you know how to navigate product review boards, you can protect yourself. But there's actually been an arms race in product reviews in recent years. And now an army of bots and real people is actually deployed online just to write puffery reviews for products on Amazon or elsewhere. And so you can't trust a lot of that now. It's a serious difficulty of a mass society and commerce in a mass society. So moving back to a pure caveat emptor system in a mass society would be, I think, a little bit far at this point. Because the protections are, it's good to have the litigation protections to
We
some
are like in
extent.
the Wild West. of the internet.
Yeah. Any last comments on this? Deontay, which system would you prefer?
Caveat.
Venditor, the one we're headed, mostly headed toward now? Is Venditor? Okay, all right. Like those consumer protections, yeah? If you were running a business, you wouldn't think that way. However, as a consumer, I totally understand your view. I get it. And I'm sympathetic to the idea of having protections like that. Good. Food for thought. Think about that. Let's take a 2 or 3 minute break, and then we'll come back and we're going to look at the topic of surveillance in marketing and the whole issue of the ethics of surveillance. Okay.